I think, 80% of a company's success is their economic decision-making cycle, period. And I say this to people and their eyes glaze over, and I think it's just because it's not an industry standard term and nobody knows how to correlate it. But when you go back and you talk about, early detection, all the rest of these things, if you are making economic decisions, that means I'm targeting something, I'm aiming, and then when I actually hit it, I expect a return. I expect to hit the target. Target, aim, hit. That's what I sort of expect to be able to happen. And that's what a good economic decision-making cycle will help you do. It'll help you do that kind of across the enterprise, across your divisions, lines, products, whatever. It's not that complicated. People are complicated. These systems are not, but it's really having that right process, the right roles, and then ultimately the right KPIs to be able to come back and say, and whether you turn them into key results, whatever, who cares, right? But like at the end of the day to say, are we performative? Because you would expect somebody comes back and says, all right, way to fire the gun, Mark. It's like, well, the point wasn't firing the gun. Why congratulating you for firing the gun? The point was to hit the target. Did you hit the target? Right. So it's ultimately like if you kind of go after the 80-20 of some of the problem we're talking about, and I think this is as true for the scaling, the technical architecture part of it, which is the technical backbone of of your business, or same thing inside of your operating model. It's really being able to go back and say, is your economic decision making cycle paying attention to these things? Yeah. Can it identify the problems that are occurring inside of these things based on KPIs and also some of it's word of mouth and whatever else? And are we getting an honest view of what those developing problems actually look like? Right? Can I see the development of them? Because I think that too is going back to an earlier point about executives is they're so used to having something kind of thrown in front of their face, make a quick decision, run, right? It's kind of like the fast food of decision making. And they kind of get lulled into a sense of security with it as if all they have to do is keep looking at whatever's put in front of their face, ask a couple pointed questions, point a direction and go. But what they often are missing, especially inside of modern enterprises, and you all are working on this from a couple different angles, I work on it too, is can you see the chasm open? Like, can you, like at some point it was like this, right? It was, you kind of like hop over that thing, as long as you got, 2 legs and willpower, you could make it, right? But eventually, it kind of does this. And as it does that, there's a pattern to it. And you may have not been paying attention to it long, but you can always start it. You can start paying attention to it. You can start actually tracking it. You can start actually measuring it. You can start actually compiling, qualitative and quantitative data on this stuff, and you can start to see these things actually happen. And if you do them well, you can actually avert things. If you continue to ignore them, you just kind of get constantly surprised, or you decide to live with whatever kind of weird limp you've caused yourself and still pretend you're a long distance runner. I don't know. Those are kind of the two options, but it happens so you can see it. We're just not built to see these things happen over time. It's part of the problem.
I do think we've seen there are KPIs and processes that seek to do something similar, which is good, right? I know you've advocated weighted shortest job first is coming to mind as like something that's attempting to weigh the economics of work to create prioritization and in a very abstract sort of way, things like that. So I think those concepts are there. But what's funny about them, and maybe this is your point, is they are so abstracted and specialized to specific sectors that from an executive perspective, it's not always easy to understand that, no, something like that is what your problem is, and you need to be paying attention to that because you're really thinking in terms of very specific sort of dollar KPIs and things like that as opposed to the abstractions. So no, I think I agree with you. I think that's probably one of the more important things. Coming back to maybe sort of the impact of these things, if we kind of go back to the analogy of your arteries are clogging up because you eat those wieners every day, there are parts of your body that are working harder and feeling that pain more than others. And I think that's probably true in organizations that are dealing with this. And I'm curious from your perspective, which roles would you say hurt the most or suffer the most? Because knowing that can help an executive kind of look for symptoms, right? And to start thinking about, well, how is this person doing? Because if these roles are struggling, maybe there's a broader issue I need to be paying attention to.
I look at it this way, there's a couple of different things you can do to start looking at kind of who hurts the most. The answer is always, if good informed economic decisions are not being made upstream, everybody downstream suffers. That's the easiest dynamic, right? So you can pick any entry level single contributor role, and they're contorted in some way, trying to avoid the reality that nobody can name out loud or even figure out what's actually happening to them, right? Except the symptoms, right? and give you a symptomology. But, usually it's from a higher level, like, business decision-making standpoint, there's largely sort of two options, right? Often what you'll find is inside of organizations, organizations either have a balanced long-term vision and long-term view and short-term view, or they're often out of whack. And at a top level, I find that all the time. It's like, oh, well, we're just like short-term, or we're just racing after these features. Okay, are those features competitive? Are you trying to gain new customers? Are you trying to retain existing customers? Or are you trying to open a new market with a different industry segment? Like, what are you trying to do with all this stuff? And they're like, I don't know, we're just chasing these things, right? And so that's kind of an example of something that's extremely, extremely short term. Or we're trying to develop a product and we're not sure if our customer actually has this problem, but we'd imagine it would be really interesting if they did, one of these types of deals. And then the long-term view on the other side is, it's kind of like the who are you going to be when you grow up type of question. Like when you really are at the next level of mature company, whatever you've chosen that to be, what does that really look like? What's it sort of take to get there? Obviously, the long term and the short term play off each other. So when there's an overemphasis on one versus the other, and it can be in pockets in companies too, right? You get some like super long termers in one area and they're in a weird place in their product life cycle. And it's like, well, you shouldn't be kind of thinking that long yet. You're barely having any traction, or they're thinking super short term, and they're at their sort of competitive peak. And it's like, you see these imbalances. But the thing that usually has to happen at that level, once you I always look for these imbalances kind of first, is that you go in and you say, what roles are missing? Because that's often sometimes too, especially as companies scale and grow. It's like, hey, we started out, you guys know, it's like, you're two cool founders taking on the world, right? And it's like, well, how many hats can I wear? It's like, all of them. But a lot of times people are left in skills or areas and it's like there's a missing role. A lot of missing roles are chief product officers, totally missing. Like the unifying vision of the organization, often missing. And then whatever like weird product structure you have underneath it is completely useless. And this happens a lot, in scaling companies. And they end up in this short-term view where they're trying to accelerate sales too fast and they lose the plot in terms of kind of like what's happening in the marketing they're developing or they're competing in. And so I think this short-term, long-term, view balance is really, really important. If you don't have that long, short balance, they're going to be insanely underperforming.